Greetings, John Lucas. This is Scott Kretschmar, the Academy historian, and I have the pleasure today to have Dr. John Lucas to interview for the Academy Archives. It is Tuesday, December 16th, 2008, and both of us are here at Penn State University. Dr. Lucas is Professor Emeritus of Kinesiology here at Penn State. And as many of you listening to this record will know, he's a renowned sport historian who's focused on the Olympic Games. And Dr. Lucas is number 241, fellow number 241 in the Academy. He was inducted in 1975. Perhaps a little later in the interview I can ask him about some of his fellow inductees who came in 1975. But I would like to start with a question about your background, where you came from, a little bit about your education so people could know what went into John Lucas.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kretschmer. My parents arrived in Boston, Massachusetts from the little country of Albania in Europe, dirt poor, unable to speak the language with almost no money, but they settled down in Boston, Massachusetts. My father sold fruit in the street, and then he started a candy store no larger than a telephone booth, and for 60 years he sold homemade candy, married an Albanian woman, my mother, of course, and raised 4 children in the city of Boston, none of whom went to college because they were children of the Depression. But I was not. I came along after World War II and was fortunate enough to attend Boston University School of Physical Education in the 1940s.
You started your career, as I understand it, here at Penn State, more as a coach than a researcher. Could you give us a little background into how you became one of the world's renowned historians? What was that path like?
Convoluted and, for me, exciting. I received my bachelor's degree in physical education from Boston University. I was number 1 in the class and was able to get a scholarship because of that to the University of Southern California, where I must admit I had a dual reason for going across the country. I was curious about California. I knew that Southern California had a marvelous physical education faculty, and thirdly, they had a wonderful track team, the best that this country has ever produced, with Dean Cromwell, the legendary coach. So I received a wonderful physical education. I received a wonderful opportunity to train and compete for a spot on the Olympic team, but I failed to make the Olympic team at the 10,000 meters and returned to Boston with a degree in my back pocket.
Yeah, that's good. What happened at Penn State then? Because weren't you hired here to coach the track team?
I did. I came across the country and went to the University of Maryland with the legendary Professor Marvin Eiler, and I worked, I must say, very, very hard. You don't find yourself a student of Marvin Eiler unless you're willing to work very, very hard. He paid my way across the Atlantic Ocean to interview people at the Olympic headquarters in Lausanne, Switzerland. I came back, finished my doctorate under Marvin Eiler, and received a phone call from Penn State University's Dean Ernest Browning McCoy, asking if I would come to Penn State as the track coach. Their coach had just retired, and the salary was astronomical compared to anything I knew. So I immediately took the position as track coach. Marvin Eiler was, to say the least, in that awkward anatomical position, beside himself, because he had spent so much time to help me become a physical educator historian. And therefore, I coached only 7 years at Penn State University, and then saw the light, went into the academic program, and almost all good things fell my way.
Well, there's a story here, and I'd like to either verify this or put it to rest for the record, that on at least one occasion when you were taking your teams to away contests, you left them alone so that you could go into the local library to do historical research. Is that true or not?
Unfortunately, it's true. I had divided allegiance at Penn State University. I was track coach, but I was deeply interested in the academic world. This is very, very dangerous because if you do not recruit well, your track program is not what it should be. And frequently, on a recruiting trip, I would stop in the Boston Public Library, the New York Public Library, the Library of Congress, the Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore, and I knew I was a very, very bad boy. I didn't sleep well, and I didn't recruit well. I didn't do anything well until finally I resigned as the track coach, because I knew that I could only do one thing well, and I wasn't even sure of that. So I went into physical education teaching and research.
When you were hired here at Penn State, my understanding is that the department was divided by gender. When I came myself in 1984, I was housed in White Building, and somebody told me a story that on the door of White Building there were signs, "Men not allowed in this building." Could you talk a little bit about the old days of the gender separation at Penn State?
I'm not an expert on this, but I was told frequently by even older physical educators than myself that this was not unique, and that there were many universities in the country that had a department of physical education for women, a separate department of physical education for men, with department heads of equal status and probably equal salary. So when the integration came through Title IX and other important national and local factors, we integrated, and the women suffered because they were no longer heads of departments.
Yeah.
Their building was Mary Beaver White building. I wrote the history of Mary Beaver White and why she gave money for the creation of a physical education building for women only. The men were here in Rec Hall. And the swimming pool on campus was in White Building, the only pool we had before the McCoy Natatorium. And men wanted to swim rather than go downtown State College. But there was a big sign on the door, not just because of the fact that the women did not want to be invaded by men to swim in their pool, but because it was a very private place for young women and female teachers. And there was a sign on the door, "No men allowed."
Eventually that sign was painted over, because when I got here I couldn't see it, but I think some of the history lingers, and I know you're right about the divisions at many schools around the country, but when we look back on that, I think we can only smile because it is many years in the past. John, you're one of the eminent sport historians in the world, and you know both personally and by studying history that we stand on the shoulders of many individuals who preceded us. When you think back to the early days of physical education in the United States, could you pick out one or two individuals that you think deserve special note or played a particularly significant role in our development as a field?
It's a very difficult question because we have had a plethora of great leaders, male and female. No profession that I know of has as many outstanding women as we do, for the simple reason that we divide our population, men and women. I don't know if they do that in law or medicine. Of course they don't. Mabel Lee was a great physical education leader, trained in Boston in the old physical education tradition. And Alma Mitchell at the University of Michigan was a pioneer in recreation. At a convention of the American Alliance of Physical Education in Detroit, Mabel Lee said to me, "John, I would like to see my friend Alma Mitchell. He's in a retirement home up in Ann Arbor, Michigan." And I said, "I don't know the way." But King McChrystal, president of the American Academy, knew the way very well, and so we piled in a car and drove to Ann Arbor, Michigan. Alma Mitchell was there in a wheelchair, and Mabel Lee was not, as she approached 100 years of age. And she strode across the room to Alma Mitchell, who was also in his very late 90s, and King McChrystal and myself backed away because we knew instinctively that history was in the making. And Mabel Lee, this tiny woman, reached out and reached down to Alma Mitchell, and she said, "Hello, Alma." And he said, "Hello, Mabel." She replied, "Do you remember the American Alliance meeting in Buffalo in 1919? "I could never forget it," Alma said. "I'll never forget the scandalous conduct of Jesse Firing Williams. This brilliant physical educator, but he certainly did like the ladies. And you found it quite repulsive for some of his overtures, and you stepped on his foot with every ounce of whatever strength you have in your lady's shoe, and he cried out in pain and never, ever was impolite to you ever again." Both Mabel Lee and Alma just chuckled for half a minute, remembering ages ago. And I looked at King McChrystal and I said, "This is crazy." And I wrote a small article about it for one of our physical education professional journals.
When I was a young boy, John, my dad was on sabbatical in California, and as you know, he was a physical educator too, and he studied with Jesse Williams. My dad never told me that story or those kinds of anecdotes about Jesse, but as a young child, I remember we stopped at Jesse Williams' house, and I believe he was in Carmel, California, or somewhere near Carmel, California. But I was too young to appreciate it. In fact, I was told to stay in the car, so I never got to meet one of the giants, but a very interesting story about one of our leaders. John, you're an individual who's lived across the transition that has been a huge change in our field, and that change has to do, of course, with our early years where we were focused largely on teacher preparation, and we were identified with preparing teachers and coaches for the public schools and other venues, to the point after Franklin Henry and other events where we seem to be more of an academic discipline now and a hub for a whole host of professions. As you know, here at Penn State, many of our students go into physical therapy and chiropractic medicine and all kinds of things that were not anticipated back in the 1950s and 40s. As you've seen this transition take place, there have certainly been growing pains as we've changed from physical education to kinesiology. Can you, from your perspective, and having seen both sides of this very clearly, talk about some of the good and perhaps some of the risks or harms that you see have occurred during this transition?
Our National Physical Education Convention goes way back to the 1880s, as many of you know, and it dealt with health, physical education, recreation, and the dance. And at the National Convention, each of these disciplines and sub-disciplines were represented by outstanding leaders, and the several thousands of people, as many as 5 to 6 and even as many as 7,000, would come to a city in the United States, and they would have the opportunity to have a lot of fun, meet old friends, make new friends. It was a wonderful gathering for a week. But so many of us, so many people began to have feelings that a single talk on the sociology of sport, a single talk on the biomechanics of sport were inadequate. They wanted more. They were hungry for more knowledge. But the convention dealt with and served all physical educators. Mm-hmm. And so more and more people, let us say, like myself, had an opportunity to attend a history of sport or a history of the Olympics. And all it did was want me to have 5 or 6 more. So we began to drift away from the national convention, not because we disliked it, but because we wanted an entire week on the sociology of sport, the history of sport, the philosophy of sport, and that's what happened.
What do you think we'll ever recapture some of the unity that you talked about and the camaraderie? And I know at some of our academy meetings and other meetings we have papers on what holds us together, if anything. Do you foresee down the road that we'll ever recapture some of the excitement of being a unified field marching toward a single goal?
No, I do not. None of us can see the future even dimly, but I can't see that happening because we all now talk an entirely different language. And the biomechanicians do not talk well to the sport philosophers. And if I may be not critical, but at least making an observation.
No offense taken.
Those in the sociology of sport talk an entirely unique language. It's the language of sociology. And we do not always understand it in the history of sport and sub-discipline. So we are all physical educators, and yet we are all super specialists, as it should be, and as it probably is when the College of Sports Medicine and when the American Medical Association meets. The heart surgeons do not necessarily have much to say to the dermatologists. Mm-hmm. But they're all medical doctors, so it's not going to happen.
Let's turn the conversation to your area of specialty. I mentioned in the introduction that you're perhaps best known for your work on Olympic research. You've been retired for a number of years, but you've really not been retired, because I know for many years you were a globetrotter and gave talks literally around the world on the behalf of the Olympic movement. You've written several books on the Olympic movement. My sense is that you've always been optimistic about the values and the ideals of the Olympic movement. You've watched the games progress. What is your view on Olympism and the Olympic Games?
I had the good fortune of writing my doctoral dissertation under the late Marvin Isler. He wrote very few books, but he was a genius in getting out of people with deep consecrated interest, like myself, the very best. And when he found out that I was interested in the Olympic Games and its history, and the founder of the Olympic Games, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, and that I had gone to the world's largest library, the Library of Congress, and found one essay on Pierre de Coubertin in the Library of Congress, no less. Marvin Isler said, "You'll have to go to Europe. That's where you go to find out about," what did you say his name was? Baron Pierre de Coubertin. Marvin Isler found me the money and the means to go to Europe. I didn't have anywhere near enough money. I stopped in the Paris Bibliothèque, because I also could read French, and read everything on Pierre de Coubertin there, maybe 100 books. I went on to the British Museum in London, England. It's half of it, it's a museum, half of it is the second largest library in the world to that of the Library of Congress. They had 20 or 30 books on Pierre de Coubertin. I read them. And then I went on to Lausanne, Switzerland, where they had libraries filled with books on Pierre de Coubertin, and stayed as long as I could until my money ran out, returned and sent lots of material home through the mail, and I had enough for a 5-volume doctoral dissertation on Pierre de Coubertin. But thank goodness, and thank you, Marvin Isler, and I remember it clearly, we worked hard for a doctoral dissertation of 222. I remember that number, 222. And I'm the first modern American physical educator to write on the founder of the modern Olympic Games, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, and I've followed and written up on his life in many, many instances for the next 50 years.
Yeah, I'm not a historian, as you know, John, but my understanding is that there was a degree of idealism in de Coubertin, and he had very high hopes for what the Olympic Games could do for the world community. Do you think his dreams are being realized? Do his dreams have a chance to be realized somewhere down the line?
Yes, I do. Amidst the commercialism and the drugs and the hype and the advertisement and the bad boys and girls who participate in the Olympic Games as athletes, they might represent 2 to 5%, that don't care for anything but themselves and the possibility of a gold, silver, and bronze medal. There is, in the brotherhood and sisterhood of Olympic athletes, if you talk to them, if you pull away the layer of cynicism and of ultra-nationalism and the language barrier, as I have tried to do for attending 55 years of Olympics, you find in the main young men and young women with athletic talent personified, and you also find young men and young women who, without even realizing it, are living the dream of Pierre de Coubertin, that for young men and women from every nation on earth to come together and to compete fiercely and honestly, fairly, in the very best interests of sportsmanship. They do it not because they have read Pierre de Coubertin, but because they have found that to hold their head up, to perform and perform to their very best, to win gold, silver, and bronze, or come in 11th place as I did, and return home a better person, a better human being, where they then can serve the impressionable young boys and girls of their own integral nation. And so the Olympic dream, even though it is masqueraded and it is not always visible, it lives. It lives today in the year 2008, 2009.
John, you talked about the importance of competition and participation, and I know from watching you here at Penn State that you're one of those physical educators who does what he says, and in fact you're well known in the area as a runner. I don't think there are many residents of State College who have not driven by you on the roads and during your daily jogs. I also know that you have kept a log of your running. Could you talk a little bit about your running discipline and what it means to you, and then could you finish by telling us how many miles you've run and how many times around the globe that amounts to?
Whatever talent I might have lie in the area of persistence and enthusiasm, not necessarily Einsteinian brains. So I am a very persistent person, and I failed to make the Olympic team as a runner, a long-distance runner, but when I returned home almost within a week, I began competing in local Boston and New England competitions. So for the next 15 years, until I was in my mid-40s, I competed in local road races. The next 15 or 20 years, I continued to run 7 days a week, 365 days a year, this time because I knew that it was good for my physical health. The last 10 or 15 years that I have run nearly 365 days a year, the third phase, I do so for the health of my inner being and my spirituality, and for whatever it is that is invisible about me, but important to me in the spiritual, philosophical, and sense of well-being, but no longer young, but feeling well. So my running of 60 years has taken 3 phases, and in yesterday's run, I ran for 63 minutes, wrote down in my diary, and looked at the end of the month of November, and I saw that I had accumulated in 60 years of running 183,000 miles, 8 times around the circumference of the globe and the equator, and of course I don't walk or run on water.
Are you planning to run today?
Oh, I most certainly am. It's a beautiful day. The weather's going to be just fine. And after I have a visit to the dentist, Joyce Lucas, my wife, will pick me up and take me home. I'll have a cup of tea and put on my shoes, and off I go in any direction that I wish.
Now, just for the record, the weather forecast today, John, is 31, sleet, and snow. So that's John Lucas's definition of a good day for running in State College.
Yes, it is, because I have my red long underwear on. I have a very good pair of shoes. And if there's no ice, black ice or any other kind of ice on the road, I will run.
Would you be willing to tell our listening audience your age as of this date?
I'm 81 years of age, born on Christmas Day, and will be 82 later on in the month.
I mentioned, John, at the start of the interview that you're Academy Fellow number 241, and you were part of the class of 1975, and I wanted to read the names of the individuals who were inducted with you, and if you wanted to comment on one or more of these individuals, it's quite an impressive list. This is the 1975 inductee list from the Academy. A. H. Ishmael, Jack F. Keogh, Seymour Kleinman, Larry F. Locke, there's John Lucas, Ernest D. Michael, Ferruccio Antonelli, Marcel Hebelnick, Jurg Vartenweiler, Mary Helen Vanier. That includes the list. So you had a very large class in 1975. Do you want to comment on any of those individuals?
I was awed by the fact that there were national and international celebrities in that list, and I wasn't absolutely sure that I belonged. in the same category as Larry Locke, for example. And he's still active, and I admire Dr. Locke as well as all the others that you just mentioned. I was young and honored to be a member of the Academy at that time, ever so many years ago, and I continued to consider myself extremely fortunate that in this elite group of men and women, I'm one of them.
John, as we draw this interview to a close, I wonder if there are any words of wisdom that you would like to leave with those who will access this archive in the future. Anything you think we should keep in mind as we move the field of kinesiology forward?
It's a truism that whatever number of schools of kinesiology and physical education exist in the United States, I know not exactly how many. My advice to a young person that wants to continue working on a master's degree and later hopefully a PhD is to seek out from those who know the better schools, the several dozen physical education institutes in the United States that have extremely talented faculties, to retain one's own enthusiasm for knowledge, not just a degree, but for the knowledge that goes with attaining the degree, to ask for admission to one of the 20 or 30 better institutions in the United States or even overseas, if one speaks a language other than English, and to never lose that desire to learn, to work hard, and to have a fire in one's belly, if not literally, then figuratively, in one's 20s, 30s, 40s, and all the way through one's 80s and 90s. We have a marvelous opportunity to do this, and a profession of men and women like no other profession that I know of.
Well, John, I think those are very good words to heed and to keep in mind as we end the interview. It has been my privilege over the last 30 minutes or so to interview one of our giants in the history of sport and physical education, John A. Lucas. It's been a joy and a privilege. Thank you very much.